welcome back to Philosophical Jew. It has been a minute. Um, Long story short, Ishtabach Lebore, I am very fortunate for the reason that I have been unable to record a video or a podcast in a while. I have been blessed with a child, thank God. She's about 4 months now. Very, very fortunate, and thank God it has been good things that have been keeping me busy. Now, that being said, I've been waiting for a while for the inspiration, so to speak, to get back into the podcasting and video recording world. I'm back at work. I have the baby. Um, things are sort of busy, so trying to find the right moment. And I saw today that JTV, a channel I truly adore for many reasons, um, has a debate with none other than Rabbi Dweck, Harav Dweck, and Rabbi Manis Friedman. And I thought there is no better way to get back into this game than by reacting to this video. So there's two parts. The first part is sort of the idea of God's interaction with the world. I wasn't particularly taken with that video. I think that from private conversations with Rabbi Dweck, I think there was more to be said there. And I think Rabbi Manis Friedman's position is not so clearly articulated in that video. Um, Either way, I mean, the gist of it is that I think that Rabbi Dweck just puts a little bit more separation between when we can say God essentially, if I had to guess what Rabbi Dweck's position was, it would be that we can't fully know when God directly interacts with us in our personal lives, whereas Rabbi Manas Friedman is of the opinion that everything that happens is a direct interaction from God, a cause from God. Um, to Rabbi Manas Friedman, the leaf that's being blown by the wind is God's will, and I'm not sure Rabbi Dweck would take that stance because it's an explicit approach that the Rambam rejects. Instead, Rabbi Dweck is of the stance, as far as I understand it, that God sustains the world and allows for the laws of nature to operate as they operate, which is a stance that I think is perfectly legitimate and no qualms with over there. But this particular video I haven't seen yet, but just from the clips, I think I'm already seeing where it's going, and it's almost an hour, so bear with me. But I will tell you my thoughts on it as we go along together. Hopefully, we will learn. We will get some clarity on this topic, and we will learn with each other. And stay tuned for many more exciting videos and projects that I have coming up. Thank you for your patience and for bearing with me. I hope that this will be an enlightening video for you, and I hope that we will be zoche to learn much together. By the way, you should know, in case you don't, I also have a Substack called Philosophical Jew, as does Rabbi Dweck. I do not know if Rabbi Friedman has one, but you can find Rabbi Dweck's Substack at thisisjudaism.substack.com, I think, and mine is philosophicaljew.substack.com. So let's get right into it, and without further ado, let's watch the video.
The Torah uses human language, God's hand, God's anger, but what do those words actually mean?
These are interface modes for me to be able to engage with something I have no connection to. As long as we have a knowledge, a sense that this is not a direct ontological description of God.
It is literally correct to say, yes, God has an arm, and yes, it's a real arm, and it's a literal arm. You mean like mine? No, not like yours. Yours is not real and it's not literal.
I find myself...
This was part of the clip that got me a little bit inspired and passionate to create this video. Suffice it to say that this Platonic idea of us living in this cave, in this world of smoke and mirrors, where nothing is really real and God is the only reality, is quite a problematic stance for many reasons. But I'll just start with this one, right? If Rabbi Friedman is currently taking the position, it seems that God has the only real arm, and our arm is not the real arm. We just have, like this, I suppose, somewhat flawed version of an arm, prone to diseases, prone to whatever it is, human limitation. But God has the real arm. There's many problems with this approach, and the most basic problem is, first of all, at that at that point you're just dividing something that's undefinable already, ergo, aka God. Right? Then and you're dividing it into further undefinable categories. If God has an arm that's the real arm and we have an arm that's a fake arm, then what is a real arm? Now, if you want to get into this whole like metaphysical approach to an arm being the conduit of action, like Philo describes it, right? And like the organ of action, and God's has a real arm, God has a literal arm, then what you're saying is nonsensical because cannot have a real arm if it's a metaphysical thing. Metaphysical things are strange. Like they're a strange category, right? Like I think that it's suffice it to say that there's a lot of things this can apply to, right? Like does God have the like let's say we eat let's say like you have a coffee in the morning. Does God have the ultimate cup of coffee? Is our coffee fake, but God's coffee is real if coffee is this activating force within us that activates our brain capacity? Like at what point do the terms we can use for God and for us, at what point do the terms become real for God but fake for us? And you really have to ask this question. There's no other way to do it, which is why the notion that I think Rabbi Dweck will probably support is that this is a little bit of a this territory is a little bit um, underdeveloped, I think, in the thought of God as ultimate reality. But let's go on.
Sensitive to some of the terms. I hear Rabbi Friedman saying, a real arm. Well, not like mine. So what is that? I think any time that we can say, well, now I get God, we're already out of bounds.
To say he can't get angry because he's God? No, he can get angry because he's God. Not he can't care because he's so big. He can care because he is God. It's a little worrisome when people say, can't understand him, drop the subject. No, don't drop the subject. You can't understand him, then work a little harder. But you got to get to know him.
This is the topic of describing God. The language we use about God himself. The Torah speaks in terms that we can understand. God's hand, God's anger, God's remembering, his anger, his love. The question is what these words actually mean. Can we meaningfully describe God at all? Or does every description risk misunderstanding something fundamental? And again, I don't think this is just abstract. This shapes how we pray, how we connect to God, how we imagine and understand our relationship with God. Rabbi Dweck, do you want to start on this one?
You're starting with me again, huh? Look, I think that Rabbi Friedman started to bring us there already, right? In the last things that he said, in kind of expressing that Chassidut invited us to speak more intimately about God. And any time that we speak about God, we're already walking a tightrope, because we have to be careful that when we speak about God, although we are regularly using human terms, as the Torah itself does, he's not a human. And we are allowed and expected, indeed, there is no other way for a human being to relate to anything other than humanly, right? It's all we've got. And so we have to even relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as humans, right? He would never expect us to relate to him as anything else. So, Dibra Torah Kilshon Bnei Adam, right? Torah speaks in human terms. I think, again, if I'm coming from the Bet Midrash of the Rambam was known to be exceedingly cautious and to exceedingly caution around these kinds of things, right? Around how do we talk about God, how do we think of, perceive God, right? So once we get around the fact that we absolutely cannot really understand God at all, right? The question is, what do we know and what can we say for our own purposes, for our own terms? So we know that God is categorically different from human beings in every, categorically meaning every single way, right? Every possible way. And he actually writes in the Moreh Nevuchim that children do not necessarily have to learn the ins and outs of hashgacha pratit or providence, as we were just speaking about, right? But they absolutely have to know that God does not have a body and that there aren't two of him. You must tell them that.
Okay, so by the way, this is very important. I haven't read this. I was talking into the mic without the mic being on. Anyways, this is very important. I was I heard this from a philosopher, and I forget. I have not seen it inside because I have not read it. I have not read it inside from the source. But there was once someone who taught me that Spinoza's critique of relating to God in any way is that imagine if we were triangles, for lack of a better term, right? If we were triangles, we would only be able to speak to sort of think of God, imagine God as a triangle. We would have no way to really think about him in a way that is not within our makeup. Okay, so whereas for Spinoza this is a critique of the idea of relating to God, and by that metric a critique of the human imagination of God, and a critique of the reality of God because it's limited by the human imagination. For the Rambam, this is actually, it's sort of a very similar point, right? Like yes, we acknowledge our limitation as human beings, but we also know that through certain in through study, through studying the God's ways, and through studying the Torah, and observing the commandments, and through appreciating the world of God, we come to a better understanding of how to interact with God in our lives, despite the limitation. Yes, the bridge is infinite, but it is a bridge we're meant to be on. Of course, I don't like using the term infinite bridge because it can imply theoretically we're all on the same part of the bridge, whereas that's not true, and the Rambam makes that very clear. Fine. This is a very important point, that God does not have a body is the conscious knowledge that we are using limited terms to get closer and closer to God. It's the conscious knowledge. So whereas for Spinoza that's a critique that we can never truly know God, and so therefore there's no point in a sense. For the Rambam, it's that we must know God, but we must know that God is not human in any way, right? So, so this is just a very important thing to keep in mind.
And so, of course, the age-old question is, well, I mean, the entirety of Torah talks about God as though he has one. The eyes of God, the mouth of God, the nose of God, the emotions of God, right? And so on and so forth. And so famously, as the Rambam puts it, he says, look, we have to recognize that none of that directly applies to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in his being, if we could even say that, right? But we can talk about it in terms of experience again, right? When somebody's angry at me, I know what it feels like. I know what it feels like to be on the other side of someone's anger. I also know what it feels like to be on the other side of someone's joy, someone's kindness. And so it's almost as though HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to us, you know what? When you feel that there's no connection, there's animosity, there's rejection, whatever the case may be. What do you got? You call that anger? Yes, I'm angry at you. Yeah. So we don't look at it as though HaKadosh Baruch Hu is angry like I would be angry or you would be angry. But there is something going on in the relationship, right, in the interaction, that we as human beings would call anger. And that is perfectly acceptable to say. Knowing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not have anger the way that you and I as human beings have anger, as an example, nor any other emotion, nor any other physical attribute, right? I use those things in my language to speak about God because all I've got. But in truth, in essence, it's as it says in Tehillim, Lecha Dumiya Tehillah. The only real praise of God is stillness, silence. What could you possibly say, right? That will actually reach and appropriately deal with him. So even as Rabbi Friedman says, does God get pleasure out of this, right? Is God happy with this? Well, of course we say those things, right? Because we're human beings, and that's the way that we relate to things. And it's important for us to be able to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that way as well, because we're human beings, and it's how we relate. I think what the Rambam would caution is that we also at the same time need to know that we're borrowing those terms. That when we use them, we're not directly talking about what God is ontologically, existentially. We're talking about how we experience God. And he uses the terms, right? As the Rav said, is it a drag for God, right? Is it a burden for God? He uses the word in the Navi. Hayu alayla torach. Your festivals, they're a burden for me. At one point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, So I think that's the important bit, right? I mean, one of the analogies that I often give for this, and it's any analogy is a crude one when we're talking about God, is like, the apps on your phone. If you want to tap WhatsApp, you see a little green square on your phone, right? You and I both know, of course, that is not the app. It is an interface for the app. The app is code. It's data. It's not that green square, right? And when I send a message to you, it's not like words are not flowing out of my phone into the ether, right? There's code. But these are interface modes for me to be able to engage with something I have no connection to. I have no direct engagement with, right? So these are the interfaces that we are allowed to engage with regards to God, as long as we have a knowledge, a sense that this is not a direct ontological description of God. So that's how the Rambam would deal with it, right? That's how the Rambam would put it. And he, like I said, to him, this is of utmost importance, because if we miss this, we tread dangerously on avodah zarah, on talking about, and just because we say God and refer to him, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are saying or referring to the appropriate God. And he's very strong about that, right? The Rambam is very strong about that. So I think that perhaps I allow a liberty, right, that perhaps the Rambam wouldn't, in recognizing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wrote himself as a character in the book and presents himself to us as a personality. And we have every allowance to engage with him as such. The Rambam would caution us and say, don't consider that to be the app, right? Recognize that it's an interface. So
Right.
that's how I might, in
That's
the short time we
fascinating.
have.
Fascinating. Rabbi Friedman, have I misread a difference of opinion here on this topic?
A subtle but very important, difference. Rambam is not saying that God does not have a hand or a mouth or emotions, because Torah says he does. What do we do with that? I think the bigger question is this: what's more real, the theory behind atomic bombs or the bomb itself? What's more real? Who's more real, the human being or the creator? There's a very big danger.
I mean, the Rambam is most definitely saying that, considering that it's in his Mishnah Torah that God has no arm, no leg, no face, no voice. It is befirush. It is explicit. It's not even something he hints at. It's of utmost importance to him. And the Rambam would the Rambam grant a metaphysical arm the way that Rabbi Friedman is implying? I don't know. We'll have to. I'm not so sure. I don't see anywhere that he makes room for that. All right, let's get back to it.
Of making us real.
You know what, guys? I'm gonna actually record. I realized I was not unmuted. Okay. You know what we're gonna do? We're gonna watch the video at 1.5 times speed. And if you want to watch the video at 1 time speed, I think you just readjust the whatever it is on YouTube. I'm not sure how the math works out there, but just this way we can get through it, and I won't take up too much of your time because the video is like an hour long.
There's a very big danger of making us real and God kind of, something like we don't really know. It's kind of vague. He's not real. And people actually preach that. Don't ever take God as real. He's a theory. He's a force. He's an energy. But when God says, let us make man in our image, what is that image? Does he have an image? And what does it mean? Metaphor. What does anthropomorphic mean? It means we really have an arm. Our arm is real. When we attribute an arm to God, we don't mean a real arm. We mean something vaguely. How do we distinguish between God's right arm and left arm? I mean, now you're getting too real about this. His right arm embraces me, not his left arm. Come on. He doesn't have an arm to begin with, and you're going to make a distinction between his right arm and his left arm? How do you know right from left? I think the thing has to be flipped. We're not using the words arm and mouth and nose anthropomorphically, which means we're describing a human reality and attributing it to God. We're doing the opposite. God has an arm, and God has anger, and God has feelings, and God, because he's real in every way. The question is, if his arm is real, what do I make of my arm, which is not similar at all? Answer is metaphor. The human arm is a metaphor for God's arm, not the other way around. We're created in his image. So God has an arm, the original real arm, like the theory of atomic energy. What happens when you actually produce a bomb? You have proved the reality of the theory. The theory is more real than the outcome. The outcome is just a product. So I think this is what we need to adjust in our thinking. What is reality? Is God reality and we're mimicking him? Or are we reality and we're trying to imagine him being something like us? God is real. He's the original being. If he didn't have anger, we wouldn't have anger. If he didn't have an arm, we wouldn't have an arm. So it is literally correct to say, yes, God has an arm, and yes, it's a real arm, and it's a literal arm. You mean like mine? No, not like yours. Yours is not real and it's not literal. It's a doll arm. It's the image of an arm. It's not a real arm. So here's the thing. Torah comes to make the divine real, because when we're born, the only reality we know is physical. And the physical is not real in the truest sense of the word. It's a reflection. It's a miniature copy of the reality. So does God really speak? Yes, he really speaks. He said, and there was. Do we really speak? No. I say, and there's not. I tell my children to be quiet, and it doesn't get quiet. I don't know why. My speech is not as effective as I wish it would be. So I think that this is the important thing. The Rambam is not saying that we are real and God can't be as real. He's saying the opposite. So it's not anthropomorphic, it's theopomorphic. When we call our arm an arm, using the same word as the Torah uses to describe God's arm, we're being theopomorphic. We're attributing divine properties to the human being because we're created in his image.
Right.
I think that's crucial to Emunah Shlema. You believe in God? Yeah. What is he? I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is the problem with deomorphism. Call it whatever you want. It is, if you think about what Rabbi Dweck is saying and what Rabbi Friedman are saying, it's sort of like the complete opposites, right? Rabbi Dweck is saying that we are limited by our language, so we use what is familiar to us to describe God. We are to describe God and God's effects. And we're crucially keeping in mind that God is not these things. For Rabbi Manis Friedman, it's like, no, we are not these things, essentially. Like we are using ourselves as a metaphor for what God really is. And I think that is a very dangerous game to play, simply because it, it to me it borders on the utmost form of idolatry, in which the human being in the image of God is legitimately um, taken to its most idolatrous form, where we view the entirety of the world as a reflection of what God is, right? And there are people who subscribe to this theory, of course, and I think it's very problematic, because it would be strange to it would be strange to assume that we are the product of God, in that we are, how should I put this? In that we are a direct reflection, a direct poor reflection of God's ultimate reality. I mean, this is a very Kabbalistic idea, like, that the worlds are sort of refracted from the top down, and so we're like in the lowest of the low, or something like that, if I recall correctly. I'm not a fan of the idea. I think it ultimately makes I think surprisingly it actually demotes God in a lot of ways to a different category altogether. Whereas I think Rabbi Dweck's position, by calling God, by pointing out that God is in fact as categorically um, dissimilar to anything in the universe, is a far more appropriate way to approach God, since we are obviously unable to understand um, God in His essence. I think that's fair. Of course, I do take a middle approach between these two, but we can get into that later.
That's not a belief. That's a suspicion. it's a it's a hope. I hope he's real. I hope he's there. No, he is reality, and we're trying to mimic him.
Hey, I really hope you're enjoying the video. Just wanted to quickly say the chat
That we
that. Thank you so much. So, Rabbi Dweck, would you agree with that characterization that yes, it is very much borrowed terms, but in the sense that it's God who is the reality here, and these terms we're using, he's the one that really has the arm, he's the one that really has these emotions in ways we can't understand, and our existence is a metaphor for that. Do you agree with that characterization?
As I listen very carefully to Rabbi Friedman's words, I sense that there is a minefield of semantics that we find ourselves in. Because I think if I understand what Rabbi Friedman is saying, he's not saying anything different than I was positing, but I find myself sensitive to some of the terms. Because when we talk about real, well, by all means, Vadonai Elohim Emet, God is truth. The greatest truth, the most.
I don't know if Rabbi Dweck is. I just have to say this. I don't know if Rabbi Dweck is being cordial, extremely cordial, with the stance Rabbi Manas Friedman is taking. But I, in fact, think that Rabbi Manas Friedman was taking the exact opposite stance of Rabbi Dweck, though it sounds very similar. To Rabbi Dweck, again, the stance is that we are using language that is familiar to us to describe how we interact with God. God is ultimately unknowable in his essence, and if you are a reasonable human being, that should not be too controversial a stance to take. God should clearly be a category of being. Even that term should be should bewilder us, that we should be able to say anything about God. That being said, God allows us the courtesy of using human terms to describe him, so that we may engage in a relationship with him. Rabbi Manas Friedman's point, however, I think, is that it is the complete opposite. It's almost as though God gave us our reality to understand him in his reality. So that's something that I think is tantamount to idolatry, because it confuses human limitation with um, with essentially it makes humanity the it makes humanity much more deliberate. It makes God a lot more anthropocentric, um, in that we are essentially just reflections of his actions, which is a strange take because that's definitively not the case. We are human beings sustained by God. Our arm is not a lesser reflection of God's arm. God's doesn't have an arm. His arm is, again, Rabbi Friedman wants to say that it's a metaphor, and is a metaphor more real than the actual thing? Um, I mean, it depends on what, but God's arm is a metaphor not from God's perspective. It's a metaphor from our perspective. I think that's the issue that we're getting to here. So whereas for Rabbi Dweck, the metaphors are all to humans slash for humans from humans. To Rabbi Friedman, the metaphors are from God in God's perspective, to God, and we are the metaphor of God in some sense. And I think that's just a very strange way to create divine players, in the world that God created. But let's go on.
Utter and real truth. And when we talk about reality, what we mean is real is what is true, as opposed to what is false. So there's no question about that, right? Absolutely no question about that. And the fact that if I have a hand, right, as it says in Tehillim, right, that, Hanotah ozen halo yishma, right, the one who creates the ears doesn't hear, hayotzer ayin halo yabit, right, the person who makes the eye doesn't see, yeah, right. So what is David HaMelech saying in that, right? He's saying, well, of course, there's no such thing as a reality for me that doesn't have some inherent essence or existence within the Creator himself, right? I think that the small bit that I find sensitive is saying that what is God's arm, and finding that I don't know what that is, and because I'm not 100% clear on what that is, that I have to know that it's like an arm, not like mine. Mine's a representation of that, right? It's some kind of rudimentary manifestation of it, right? But as most human beings, when they hear arm, they don't know what that means then with regards to God, right? So I hear Rabbi Friedman saying a real arm. Well, not like mine. So what is that, right? It gets quite sensitive, and the only thing that I would be very cautionary, not to the rabbi chas v'shalom, but in general in terms of people listening, right? If I were, is because I don't necessarily have full ability to be able to hold God between my ears, and that there are going to be things about God that I don't understand. It doesn't make him any less real, nor a theory. He is the only real thing. If I am at all right real, it's because of his reality. So I think that there's a concern or caution, and I'm not saying this only on my own account. The way that I would understand the Rambam is we have to be very careful not to make God, and I'm not saying that the rabbi is saying this, but we have to be very careful not to make God human so that we can grasp him. And by grasp, I mean genuinely, like, okay, now I've got him. I think any time that we can say, well, now I get God, we're already out of bounds. He's not something that we can get.
Okay, I think I just need to stop giving my take on Rabbi Dweck because he explains exactly what I say like 5 seconds later in a far more lucid and eloquent fashion. So I'll try to hold back a little bit more on this, but we'll see.
He's something that we can absolutely know to be real. The most real, capital R real, right? The ultimate truth without question. But we have to be very careful about containing him in order to say that he's real. That's the only thing that I would
Okay.
be gentle about.
Interesting, Rabbi, for sure. Rabbi Friedman, what do you feel about what Rabbi Dweck said there? That got to be careful with any words to sort of ascertain that we can get God.
Yeah, of course. We also have to be careful not to make him less than human.
Absolutely. But the question is, what do we do with that? Do we make him human in order to not make him less than human? No. And I don't imagine that the Rabbi is saying that, but what do we do?
We recognize that there is nothing that is lacking in him. So to say he can't get angry because he's God? No, he can get angry because he's God. Not he can't care because he's so big. He can care because he is God. Now, it's like a child saying, I get scared. And the mother says, well, I also get scared. And the kid says, no, you don't. You're grown up. No, the mother gets scared, but on an adult level, which the child does not appreciate, the distinction. So yes, God has an arm. The Torah is not playing games because it's so prevalent. God's arm, God's ears, God's mouth, and none of it is true. He doesn't have an arm. Does he have a right arm and a left arm? Yes, Torah says he has a right arm and a left arm. Oh, come on, he's God. He doesn't have an arm. No, he's God, so he does have an arm. You don't understand what a godly arm is? Of course you don't understand. You're not godly. But don't think that the only arm that is real is the physical, because we know that the physical is not real.
Okay, so look, when you say that, do I understand what a godly arm is? No, you don't. That already removes it
But
from
it is an
anything that I
arm.
could possibly know. Right?
But it is an arm.
Okay, but again, what could that possibly? But that is a positive assertion, right? So I hear what the Rabbi is saying, right? Whatever it is that Hakadosh Baruch Hu lifts with, smites with, yeah, we call that an arm. That's his arm.
Right, it is an
but we
arm.
have no idea what that is.
Yeah. So if you want to understand at least a little bit, compare it to your arm, because your arm is a mushal. See, Rambam says mushal. He doesn't say it's not true.
Correct.
So a mushal means a reduced example of something more abstract, but it's got to be correct. It can't be a lie.
The mashal has to be a genuine reflection.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So what do we know about God's arm? We know his arm is not his nose. His nose is not right. His right arm is not his left arm. What do we know about right and left? Well, take a look at yourself. Look at yourself and see. You're created in his image. Do you have two arms? Yes. One is on the right and one is on the left? Yes. One is dominant and one is not? Right. God's right arm is the dominant arm. His left arm is the one that he uses to punish, which he does not relish. So that's his weaker arm. So we're talking real, legitimate arm. What we are cautioned is don't reduce it to physical, because physical takes it out of the realm of real.
Yeah, see, this is where I think that there's a breakdown in what Rabbi Friedman is trying to say. Like, if we are saying that he keeps using the terms, yes, the arm is real, but it's a godly arm, and we don't know what a godly arm is. We don't have any idea. There's no difference between saying that and saying God affected this to be the case. We just use the term God's arm as a shorthand for God's actions, in a sense, right? Like I don't know, we're reading the current Torah portion of Vayikra. We just moved to Tzav, and there's a lot of the term Reach Nichoach LaHashem, that the sacrifice is a pleasing aroma to God, right? So obviously one does not smell with an arm; they smell with their nose. So we're talking about quote unquote God's nose. But in Rabbi Friedman's terms, this is the ultimate nose. But once you get there, you don't actually need to say that this is the ultimate nose. You could just say, like Rabbi Dweck is saying, we're using human terms to describe an effect that God is enacting. We are not saying that God has a real nose or God has the ultimate nose, right? And if we are saying that God has the ultimate nose, it's essentially a redundant statement which further confuses concepts of the infinite, or concepts which we cannot define, because anything that is godly, and we're applying it legitimately to God, if it's undefinable, then there is no point in differentiating the terms unless we're doing it to understand it from our perspective. We cannot say that that is legitimately God's arm or nose or scent of some sort. This is why the distinction is so important that Rabbi Dweck is drawing. We're really risking, and I think that it's evident that the stance that Manas Friedman is taking Rabbi Friedman is taking is a lot closer, can drive someone a lot closer to idolatry and anthropomorphizing, or even though they'll claim it's deomorphizing, or whatever the term was, I forget, than what Rabbi Dweck is positing and what the Rambam posits. But I just we have to be very careful here. Like, I think that this confusion is very important, and this slight nuance is extremely vital in the Jewish Weltanschauung on virtually all of our understandings of the Torah and of God.
Well, I don't think it's just physical. I think that it's also making God into parts, which is also a problem. I think that the important thing that I'm hearing the Rav say is that we tend to reduce Hakadosh Baruch Hu in kind of hesitating to speak about these things, right, into less than, rather than, right, if I'm understanding correctly. Right? Okay, so I think that's...
Like, for example, a really serious issue is when I hear people suffering, it hurts me. Does it hurt him? No, he doesn't care. What?
Okay.
I am more sensitive than he is? I am more...
I think that Rabbi Friedman is pointing out a pitfall, right, of the Rambam's theology, right? And the Rambam is pointing out a pitfall in the alternative theology. And I think that they are genuine pitfalls, right? And there's a certain element of sophistication there is subtlety and sensitivity and sophistication that it requires in order to be able to kind of get what it is that we're talking about when we do and how we do, even how we talk. Yeah, there was a Zen master Dojin, if I could mention him, and he said, before a person studies Zen, a mountain is a mountain, a tree is a tree, and a river is a river. And when a person starts to study Zen, a mountain is no longer a mountain, a tree is no longer a tree, and a river is no longer a river. And one becomes a master of Zen. A mountain is once again a mountain, a tree is a tree, and a river is a river. So it sounds profound, but essentially the way that I understand that is when we talk about, yes, the Torah speaks about God's arm, God's eyes, God's nose. And I think what everybody would agree on is that we are not to think about God as a big person in the sky with these things. But that when when the Torah uses those terms, it is referencing something very real about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we can only know by our own reference, right? We are the referent, right? Because it's all we've got, as the Rav said, and at the same time we have to know that, and this I think is what the Rambam would stress, is that he's not angry, but we cannot say in assertive terms that he is angry, because when I say that, I tend to say it in the way that I understand anger. And that's the Rambam's concern, right? So the Rambam is like looking specifically at a specific pitfall. Rabbi Friedman is looking at another pitfall, right? And these things are part of the navigation and dealing in a faithful way with HaKadosh Baruch Hu as human beings, right? So I think that's how I'm hearing it. But I do think that the Rambam's concerns remain concerns and genuine pitfalls that we also have to be very careful about falling into.
Rabbi Friedman?
Well, the way I'm presenting it, the way Hasidus presents it, it covers both pitfalls. On the one hand, it's saying God is very real. On the other hand, it's saying don't think of him as human, because human is not real. So it covers.
So I think that I think that the word "real" here is what do you mean when you say real? Imaginary? Not imaginary? Is the Rav saying that humans are imaginary? I don't imagine that that's what you're saying.
No, substantial. I think a good word would be substantial.
Okay,
we think we are substantial because we're solid. You can feel it, you can touch it, you can measure it. That makes it substantial.
Okay.
The truth is, no, that doesn't make it substantial, because we know that what we see is not really what we're seeing. And when we get angry, it's not really anger; we're just losing control. Yeah. And when we speak, it's not really productive. So,
amen.
Yeah. So we're born into a world of the physical, and we think that that's the measure for reality. And everything has to be compared to our reality. Does God really have an arm? Why are you asking that? Because his arm is not like mine. Mine is real. What's his? Torah turns it upside down. The theory is always more substantial than the outcome. The outcome is just a product of the truth of the theory. So the spiritual is always more real than the physical.
Yeah. I think
we really need to work on that, because it goes against our born condition.
Yes.
That something more tangible is more real.
Okay, I understand what that means now. Yes.
So that produces a certain.
And I think that the Rambam absolutely presents things that way as well. I don't think that there's a question about that.
Yeah, I think so too. And that itself is an important thing. The shift in what we perceive as real, very important. It's like AA has a very good expression.
Honestly, was not expecting that level of agreement on this topic. We may need to reassess what Rabbi Friedman is saying, but I'm not too convinced. Like I understand the concept that our reality is perhaps it should not be the measuring stick by which we measure what reality is. That's fine. I still think the terms with which are bandied about by people, let's say, far less learned than Rabbi Friedman, who are recipients of the culture of trickle-down intellectualism, often do not use the terms as a nuanced fashion as Rabbi Friedman may be using them. So I'm still quite against this framing, even with the subtlety that Rabbi Friedman presents, and that Rabbi Dweck agrees with. I still think it's quite dangerous territory, just because it takes a lot to really get there and understand that and keep that in mind all the time when you're bandying about these terms. You're gonna have to keep in mind that really we're not the reality, and that God is the ultimate reality, and nose is not the nose that we know, and an arm is not the arm that we know, and like at this point, in all honesty, there's just no point of these terms, in my opinion. I'm not really sure what else to make of that, but fine.
Don't believe everything you feel. It's so good. This gets me angry. So you're angry. It's a feeling. Don't believe in it. Well, what could I do? I was angry. I had to. No. Anger is not the ultimate deciding factor of how you behave. It's a feeling. You don't have to believe it. But we're so hung up on everything about me is real. No, it's not. Your fears are not real. Your anger is not real. Your desires are not real. Don't take yourself so seriously, because there's something more real than what you're feeling or thinking or wanting. That humility is essential to sanity even. Never mind to Yiddishkeit.
You have to check out the trailer for our new documentary. One of the last elements of this that I think just gets to maybe one point of slight difference that I'm hearing here is that there seems to be, as Rabbi Dweck is saying, this is semantics, and actually there's quite a bit of alignment, but specifically in terms of God now and understanding him. And when we use words, we know that it's our human brain can see a physical world. We know that this is just a metaphor for God, and we can't fully understand that. But the question I feel like I don't have complete clarity on here is whether these words are describing God's essence, and can we say they're describing God's essence? Ultimately, the Torah is using these words. God is using these words to describe aspects of himself. So, is this part of his essence, who he is, or do we have to keep using that phrase kavar yachol, as it were, so to speak? God has all these things. Rabbi Dweck.
Look, I think again, this is a major issue of semantics, because if we were to talk, when you say essence, when you say God's essence, what do you mean?
Immutable characteristic.
I just have to say, very recently, I've reached out to Rabbi Dweck with this exact question, probably multiple times for like the past 2 months. So I have like this wonder if is he like sort of does he have the same reaction when he's reading my text about this? Yeah, I just think that's funny. I want to see what he says about this.
If you're talking about God, as the Rambam says, right, it presents as Matzui Rishon, which is the foundation, right, the earliest of all things, and we don't even mean that temporally, right? We mean that ontologically, the ultimate source for all things, what we might call in English as a necessary being, something that relies on absolutely nothing for its being, right? And when we talk about being on that level, we're already bordering on a word that doesn't fit, because to use a word for anything, Ali, means that you have to know its opposite or alternative. That's what a word is. A word delineates something from what it isn't. And that means you have to conceive of what it isn't. So if there's something that you cannot conceive of its alternative, you're already in trouble, right? You're already in deep water right there. And when we start talking about God, we're already there. Because whenever we say anything about him, it by definition means that we're talking about something that is not that, right? Which we don't have the capacity for. So if that's what you mean when you talk about God's essence, right? God in his ontological reality, nothing that we say is a reference to it. So anything that we are talking about is talking about our experience, perception, and so on with regards to that ultimate reality. So I completely understand and acknowledge and even agree with the point that Rabbi Friedman is making about the ephemeral, insubstantial nature of anything that is not God, physical or spiritual for that matter. Because anything that is not God is contingent on God. He is the only thing that is not contingent on anything. So I completely appreciate and understand and agree with that point. Again, not that the Rav needs me to agree on anything. When you say, when the Torah presents these things to us, right? Is it talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Is it talking about God in real terms? Well, in a sense, to humans, right? That's the point of saying Dibrat Torah Kilshon Bnei Adam, right? In other words, there's clearly an interest for humans to relate and connect to God. And if humans are to relate and connect, the only way that they can relate and connect is in human terms. They have no other terms. We have no other terms through which we can relate to anything. And I mean the entirety of a human being, including the soul, right? Which is not equal to God, right? Even though it is the breath, as the Torah says, of God. Like Pach be'apav nishmat chayim, right? Ner Hashem nishmat adam. Yeah. But even that, in its current state, right, is tremendously limited. And therefore, anything that Torah says to us is a communication to us in our terms of a reality. I'm not saying that it's not of a reality, a capital R reality, That is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? But we do have to understand, and I don't hear Rabbi Friedman saying anything different. We do have to understand that when we relate to it, we first and primarily tend to relate to it in human terms, and we have to pause and recognize that God is not human. And so this whole thing about, less real or more real, I hear that. I'm uncomfortable personally, but so what? So I'm uncomfortable. That's not real either, is it? Right? The question of reality is I think we have to be sensitive with, because at the same time we don't want human beings to consider themselves not real.
But Rabbi, you
I
familiar with
very much appreciate the term substantial, right? I very much appreciate that, because when you're talking about contingent realities, nothing lasts, nothing holds, nothing is as bedrock and foundational as God. There is just nothing like it, right? So
how do you make sense of the phrase I think it's in the Gemara that says that Anochi, or the first word of the Ten Commandments that God spoke to us on Mount Sinai, is an acronym for I'm giving you my soul in written form. That's what the Torah is. It sounds like very much like written form of essence.
Okay. I think we have to be extremely careful about talking about God in terms of severed parts or transferred parts. We have to be very careful with that.
Okay, so I've given Rabbi Dweck a headache on this point. I think that what Ali is saying is a very astute point, and I'm not sure that I think it needs to be emphasized. The Torah, even if you cannot say anything about God's essence, based on our observations of how God affects the world or how God enacts His will in the world, this is where I differ a little bit in my understanding of God, where I take sort of like an in-between approach between Rabbi Dweck and Rabbi Friedman. So whereas Rabbi Friedman might say God has the most real arm or nose or eyes or ears or whatever it is, I don't think those terms should be applied to God for reasons I've already explained. But what I do think can be applied to God is something Ali very astutely pointed out. When the Torah is given and when the prophets speak in the name of God, there is a common spirit that underlies the words, and there is a common goal that's pointed to by the text of the Torah and by God's will within the Torah. If God does things with the absolute will, with the absolutely clear divine will, to me, that says something about God. Now, perhaps we can wax poetic on whether the only thing we'd be able to interpret from that is human in its in even its most eloquent form. It wouldn't be godly. I am not convinced that you are not able to say of God's will that God's will points to something like the good, for example. And I'll tell you the reason for this and why I'm less hesitant to use terms like good when it comes to God is that as opposed to the term arm and eye and ear and nose, which are legitimate physical realities that we envision, and perhaps that is a mistake, and perhaps God's ears, eyes, and nose, which I don't believe that God has, even in the metaphorical sense. Um, they are confused with physical parts which are divisive. However, the good is an abstract notion, and abstract notions are far less divisive. They're in fact they could be all-encompassing of a being such as God. So, for example, if I'm fortunate enough to have a friend that I'm reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in which he discusses what is the good, essentially. What is it? What does it mean to be good? And it's actually very, very complicated to define, even experientially or technically. It's a very difficult thing to define, but we sense it when we see it. In a sense, there's these shared experiences and these shared qualities that good things have, but we can't put our finger on it exactly. Yet we use the term all the time. So when it comes to God, I think that, like Ali is saying, you can read the Torah and come to the conclusion that Kod Avid Rahamana Letava Avid, that everything that that the divine, the merciful wills is, or that the merciful enacts, or the merciful referring to God, is for the best, is for the good. Right? So I think you can make that assertion about God based on his interaction with the world. Just because, I mean, I have no conception of what it would mean for a being to interact with the world in a way that doesn't tell us anything about said creator or said being. I'm fairly confident that Rabbi Dweck would disagree with me on this, and for that I do apologize. But I have to just be honest here. I'm not as strict on this one as Rabbi Dweck is.
I understand the mashal, right? I recognize that it is a representation of something that I'm supposed to relate to, not in theory, right? Just because something is not literal doesn't mean that it's not serious and real. I think that's a big mistake that people make, right? When people say, oh, this is a metaphor, people hear that as fairy tale. And that is a terrible, terrible mistake. It's simply telling you something in ways that you might be able to connect to it. Forget about grasp it. Connect to it. Relate to it. That you otherwise have no means to do because of the confines of the condition of your existence as a human being. So to say that about Torah, of course, I mean, Kadosh Baruch Hu is presenting to us, his soul. Whatever. What does that mean? So once you press someone to say, well, now please define this.
It means what we began with.
Okay, yafeh.
Is God's attention more on a human being because he relates, or on fish with whom he doesn't relate?
Yafeh, we're back to the beginning.
Right. So is that dividing God into parts?
It's recognizing that there is it's a sensitivity to the language, that we're not actually splitting God. It's a question of what the fish is as opposed to what the human is, and what is the nature of that entity vis-a-vis God. As you said, Rav, God doesn't change.
No, he doesn't change, but God is all-inclusive. So yes, there's a part to him that is essential. There's a part to him that is mechanical, just has to do it because that's how the world needs to be structured. There are things that God loves, things that God hates. These are not different parts. That's him.
Yeah, I hear. And there's no question about the fact that Torah presents things that way to us. But I think that every single one of those things needs unpacking.
Fine. That's why
okay, so then we're not disagreeing. We don't disagree on that.
So it's not a problem. It's just something we need to learn.
Yes.
I want to go back to the Hashgacha Pratis part. There's a beautiful little story.
Just before Rabbi Friedman goes back there, I think this is important because Rabbi Dweck did say, yes, God's soul is poured into the Torah, the text of the Torah. This is actually a very interesting thing. I'm surprised Rabbi Dweck said. It's sort of almost like, I think Rabbi Dweck has made this point in the video, but he is comfortable. He is far more. He uses the words that would be applied to humans when it comes to God far more scarcely, and with far more deliberation than most people who are attracted to Chassidut tend to do. And so, and I guess the line to draw between is that dividing God into parts is a very thin one, which is what I think needs to be split up a little bit more in the video. I hope they get to it. But this is a very important point. You don't want to split God more. But again, if you always keep in mind that this is how God relates to us, or this is how we relate to God, and God sort of, I had a rabbi once, and he was actually the grandson or the great grandson of Rabbi Dessler, who wrote the Michtav Meliyahu. And he told me that we should feel honored that God insults himself by using human terms so that we can relate to him, though the terms are extremely handicapped, just because of the reality of the being they are attempting to describe. And I think that's what Rabbi Dweck's main point is. And but I think that using the terms the way Rabbi Friedman might use them gives the terms a lot more power than they should have. I think that's a good way to put it. I think that's the differentiating factor here.
This old couple are sitting in the car, and the wife says, "Sam, what happened to us? When we first got married, we used to sit close next to each other. Now look at us. I'm on this side of the car, you're on the other far side of the car. Why did you move away?" And Sam was trying to control the car. and can barely see over the wheel. He says, "What do you mean? I'm driving. If I move, we crash. So if anybody moved, it must have been you." That's in a sense what God is saying. Has the relationship changed? Well, I can't move away. I'm running the show. If I move away, the world crashes. So if anybody moved away, it must have been you. So come on back.
Yeah.
So, Rabbi, you'd say you're essentially in alignment with what Rabbi Dweck said about how we have to understand these semantics, how we have to understand the question of talking about essence.
Yes, we have to understand. In fact, it is the first mitzvah that Rambam says. The first mitzvah is get to know him. Don't treat him like a mystery, like a vague concept. Get to know him because he's more real. He is the original, the being, the real. So everything is included in him. There's nothing he's not.
With the caveat that we can't fully get to understanding his essence because it's just not possible.
Well, the caveat is that we think we are all-inclusive and there's nothing we're not.
That's true.
We disabuse ourselves of that concept.
Okay, that's fair. But again, the Rambam explicitly also states that God does not have an arm, leg. If we use our arm as the metaphor for God's arm, so to speak, it's usually metaphors are in order to get closer to what something is via an abstraction. You know, the assumption that we're the abstraction when it comes to God makes us more of an ethereal entity than God is, which I think is ultimately an indefensible stance. But that was pretty funny.
You're barely something. He is everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, like me yitem pele adam leish. Moshe says, I can't talk, I can't speak. God says, well, where do you think it comes from?
So very simply, I'll put to both of you, what does knowledge of God mean? The first mitzvah is to get to know God, to know God. What does that mean, Rabbi Dweck?
It's connection. And connection is to put your attention and thought and care and your understanding, all of it, to him, to God. So if it means that you have to spend more time, sorry.
Demystify him.
Yeah. If it means
that sounds very me focused. What about my knowledge of him?
Yeah, it's lower your head, bow your knee, open your heart, and allow for yourself to experience, learn, understand, accept, serve God. That's knowledge. It's
Rabbi
not,
Friedman?
let me see if I can figure this out here, and if I like it, I'll hold it. Well, that has everything to do with you. It doesn't have much to do with God. When somebody is in love, Ali, right, they essentially efface themselves and run after this object of their affection like it is the only thing in the world. That is how a person is to engage with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or at least strive towards that direction.
Right. Rabbi Friedman, what does it mean to know God?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. When you're in love with somebody, you strive, you desperately seek ways of getting closer. What happens in a marriage? A guy says, I love my wife. I don't know what's wrong. She's not happy. In one way or another, the wife will say, he's kind, he does everything right, he's a good man. He has no idea who I am, and he doesn't care. He's in love, and that's all he is. So part of getting closer to God is to actually get to know him the way we know any other subject. To dismiss him as mysterious is not a good relationship.
To dismiss him as mysterious is a way to say, he's not for me.
That's right. Yeah, it's like when a man says, you can't understand women. I say, uh-oh. How happy is your wife in this relationship? Why do you say that? Why are you so comfortable with the idea that you'll never understand a woman? Because
and at the same time, I think if we're using the analogy, it's to recognize, right, that a woman doesn't think like you, that she doesn't approach the world like you. You really need to get to know her on her terms.
Exactly. Yes.
So it's not about mysteriousness. It's about recognizing.
It's a little worrisome when people say, "Les machshava trisabeh." You can't understand him. Drop the subject. No. Don't drop the subject. You can't understand him. Then work a little harder. But you got to get to know him.
Yeah.
Because to know him is to love him.
And presumably the work of ever closer oneness is an infinite project because God is infinite, we're finite, and the closeness can become
There's
more
always another level of closeness you can attain as long as you have breath in your lungs, Ali.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So it's amazing that the Rambam says, what's going to happen after Mashiach comes? We're all going to pursue the knowledge of God. Hey, we've been doing that all along. We're going to still be pursuing after Mashiach comes? Endlessly. Infinitely. But it will be real knowledge.
Yeah.
Not approximation.
This is actually a very beautiful conclusion. There is this. I'm very influenced by Abraham Joshua Heschel. I have yet to encounter anyone's writings who are as prophetically reminiscent as his. And there's this short collection of his I highly recommend anyone read. It's called Thunder in the Soul. And it is an essentially the most eloquent of reflections that I've ever seen on what it means to feel God in this way, in this striving, loving way. And this just brought those up to me. But I really like the way that this video is ending.
Well, Rabbi Dweck, Rabbi Friedman, this was truly a privilege and an honor to be able to moderate this conversation from two rabbis that are so dear to me and that I've learned so much from. Thank you so much, both of you, for being so generous with your time and insights and having such a faithful dialogue. This is truly what they call l'shem shamayim, a discussion, a conversation that is about seeking truth and knowledge. And I'm thrilled to see that actually there's a great deal of crossover of thought and understanding. And I'm so sure that so many of our viewers are going to just relish this conversation. So thank you to both of you.
An honor and pleasure.
Doing a great job, Ali.
Indeed.
Thank you so much. I'm not against Judaism. I'm just against.
All right, guys. So that was my first video back. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you want to do more. If you want me to do more reaction videos. This was a great conversation. I was so shocked when I saw this come up in my feed because this is not a conversation I saw happening anytime soon. But good job, JTV. Great job, Aldi, on the moderation. I can't wait for more videos like this. I'm glad to see the Jewish world is heading in this direction where we actually have discourse between different rabbis on these very important topics who usually have very similar views if they're in a conversation together. But it appears that we're finally getting some rabbis who very much disagree and can have a respectful dialogue about it, which I have not seen in quite a while. So great job, JTV, and I hope to see more videos like this. All right, signing off, and until the next one. See you guys. Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in to the Philosophical Jew podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I have spent many months creating Philosophical Jew, but nearly a decade preparing for it. In addition to the Philosophical Jew podcast, there is also a Substack. The Substack is a platform I use to write on various topics in Jewish and regular thought in the world. Topics such as philosophy and theology primarily. If this interests you, check it out at philosophicaljew.substack.com. Additionally, you can find me on Instagram at @aphilosophical_Jew, and on X as @aphilosophical_Jew, and on Spotify for the audio versions, and on YouTube for the video versions of the podcasts. Occasionally, I do reaction videos, and have a few more coming up. If you enjoyed this content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Have an amazing day.